Thank you for joining us. My name is Laurel Townhead, and I lead the Human Rights and Refugees Programme for the Quaker United Nations Office in Geneva. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, also on behalf of the co-organisers, along with CUNO, War Resisters International and Connection EV. And it's great to see so many screens of people. We wanted to hold this webinar to introduce the most recent report on conscientious objection to military service from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and to share ideas on how we can use this separately and together in our work, our advocacy, our campaigns for the right to conscientious objection and the rights of conscientious objectors. For an outline for this webinar, first, we're going to have an introduction to the report from Daniel Mergster, who's a human rights officer at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the principal drafter of this report. Then we'll open the floor for questions and reflections and discussions, which will be moderated by Zaira Zafarana from Connection EV. And then Natalia Garcia from War Resisters International will close the meeting at the end. And we have plenty of time to hear from you. So in order for us to make the most of that time we have together, I'm going to hand over now to Daniel Mergster from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Daniel, this report has been very recently delivered to the Human Rights Council, which is currently in session in Geneva. Can you introduce the report and tell us what some of the key highlights are? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Laurel, and thank you to both the Quaker UN Office, Connection EV, and War Resisters International for inviting me, and thank you to all participants as well for taking time off your days to discuss our most recent report on the issue. Now, this report was prepared pursuant to a mandate by the Human Rights Council to submit a report with recommendations on legal and policy frameworks to uphold human rights in the context of conscientious objection to military service. Well, in accordance with human rights law and standards applicable. And as you say, the report was presented to the Human Rights Council this present session. Now, in preparation of the report, we organized an intersessional workshop that was held at the end of October last year. We issued a call for inputs to states, UN entities, as well as a general open call for submissions. And we also carried out desk research. Now, I think first things first, the report affirms the right of conscientious objection to military service, which in the practice of the Human Rights Committee is recognized as an absolute right, permitting no exceptions. Now, the report then goes on to examine 5 different issues. First, the recognition of the right in the domestic laws of states. Second, the procedure for recognition of conscientious objector status. Third, genuine alternatives to military service. Fourth, other measures to respect and ensure the rights of conscientious objection to military service. And lastly, the right of conscientious objectors arriving from third states. Now, just to look at each of these briefly in turn. First, with respect to the recognition and domestic laws of states. Here, the report recommends that states should give recognition to the right to conscientious objection to military service in their domestic legal systems. It also specifies that such recognition should be general. It should be applicable to all forms of military service. It should be applicable in all contexts. It should be unconditional, and it should also be justiciable, which means that you should be able to bring claims regarding the right before domestic courts. Now, this recommendation was issued because the report observes that there is no uniform practice among states in the manner in which they give or don't give recognition to the right in their domestic legal systems. Some states do not recognize it at all. Some states have explicit recognition, either through constitutional or subordinate laws. Some states have achieved such recognition through interpretation by courts. For example, the interpretation of a general right to freedom of religion or belief. And lastly, there are states that have what one might call a sort of quasi-recognition, in a sense that they only specify the conditions for the exercise of exceptions to military service obligations. Now, secondly, what we observed is that the legislation in several states permit exceptions to the right. And these exceptions take two forms. First, as scope limitations, in a sense that even if they recognize the right in their domestic legal systems, there are some categories of conscientious objectors that would be excluded. One of the forms in which that is done is by elevating the threshold for recognition, in a sense that, say, for example, they only recognize those conscientious objectors that have a demonstrated manifestation of their religion or belief. Secondly, in some states, they're only recognized for some forms of compulsory military service. And then there are those states that only accept it for some forms of religion or belief, for example, specified religious society, members of specified religious societies and so forth. The second type of restriction is that there are some states that permit exceptions to the right, for example, in situations of armed conflict. Now, there are lots to be said on all of those things, but I think there our recommendation tries to reiterate a consequence of the fact that the right is an absolute right, and so therefore also the legal basis in domestic law should reflect the full scope of the right and not permit exceptions such as in situations of armed conflict. Now, it also identifies that the consequences of the lack of recognition can be harsh in some domestic systems. So, frequently the act of refusing compulsory military service is criminalized. In some jurisdictions, there are other consequences. And there are often few remedies to challenge those types of restrictions in the exercise of their rights. The second point that the report deals with relates to procedure. And here the report in its recommendations remind states that the purpose of the procedure should be aimed to facilitate the exercise of the right. And building on previous reporting, it recommends that states should consider accepting claims of conscientious objection without an inquiry process. And if they don't, that procedure should, ensure the dignity of individuals. It should be conducive of protecting the right. It should be limited to identifying relevant information without arbitrary interference in the privacy of those concerns. And the inquiry process should be under civilian control. Now, OHCHR reporting has observed multiple challenges in systems that adopt an inquiry procedure. In effect, the inquiry procedure is often unduly intrusive and ineffective in identifying the religious beliefs of the religion or religious or other beliefs of the individual concerned. And we have also seen examples of that entail abusive behavior against those requesting recognition of their conscientious objector status. We have also identified challenges with respect to procedural guarantees, such as the example of determinations not being made in a timely manner, there not being suspensive effects that apply to the individual concerned while the request is being considered, and, for example, inadequate avenues for appeal. And so that is also the backdrop for which we, well, the report sort of urges states to consider removing inquiry procedures. That is a novel recommendation as compared to previous reporting. Third, the report examines genuine alternatives to military service. And here it also recommends that states should consider removing compulsory alternative service for individuals exempted from military service. And for those states that retain such compulsory alternative service, it should be compatible with the reasons for conscientious objection. It should serve the public interest. It should encompass a variety of alternatives spanning various sectors. And states should also consider ways in which they could accommodate the preferences of conscientious objectors for placement in alternative service. And lastly, but importantly, any alternative service measures should not be punitive or discriminatory. Now, the backdrop for this recommendation is that we observe that there has been a move in several states to remove compulsory alternatives to military service, and that there also are persistent challenges in several states with respect to their systems of alternative service. And I mean, recalling also that under international law, there's really no obligation to maintain a system of compulsory alternative service. Now, the fourth aspect that we examined was related to other measures to respect and ensure the right of conscientious objection to military service. And here the report recommends that states refrain from unduly restricting the rights of those advocating for the rights of conscientious objection, and that states should implement appropriate measures, including education and training, to foster a culture of respect for conscientious objection, both in public administration and in society at large. And that they should implement a participatory approach in the development and review of laws and policies related to conscientious objection. Now, these recommendations do not deal with the right of conscientious objection to military service directly, but they are meant to foster a culture of respect for the exercise of the right. And of course, at the bare minimum, this would entail that ensuring that civil society and conscientious objectors themselves are able to freely advocate for the exercise of the right. The recommendation to implement educational and training within public administration is, of course, also coming from a backdrop that we've observed with respect to inquiry procedures, where there perhaps could be an added value in fostering a culture of greater understanding for both the right and the motivations leading individuals to exercise that right. With respect to society at large, public messaging and educational programs are meant to address the reality in some countries that conscientious objectors are stigmatized, and in some instances also suffer from discrimination. Now, the participatory approach spans, the recommendation there spans all aspects of both the development and review of laws and policies, including the setting up of administrative procedures to maintain or to handle the processing of conscientious objection requests. And it's meant also as an addition to to the educational programs to hopefully permit public authorities to take into account the experiences of conscientious objectors and other affected stakeholders. Now, the last point addressed in the report relates to the rights of conscientious objectors arriving from third states. And here the recommendation is that states should respect and protect the rights of conscientious objectors arriving from such third states, including by adherence to the principles of non-refoulement in international human rights and refugee law, and the implementation of and dissemination of guidance on the interpretation of applicable international law. And this comes against the backdrop we've seen in the last, particularly in the last couple of years, where there's a high number of individuals fleeing their country of nationality, currently involved in armed conflicts, and which are implementing systems of conscription in various forms. In this regard, we noted concerns that existing procedures in many states make the achieving a refugee status for individuals or for the conscientious objectors perhaps unduly difficult. And the report also takes note in this respect that many states have not taken into account guidance on how to tailor those refugee status determination processes with respect to conscientious objectors. Now, this is sort of a relatively long and general summary of some of the recommendations, but I think I'll keep it relatively short. And so I'm happy to hear your reflections on the report or points made in the course of the presentation. And yeah, I would be very interested in hearing how this report perhaps could feed into your advocacy strategies and ideas. But yeah, and also happy to go into detail of any points mentioned. Thank you.